The air around the auction yard was thick with dust and impatience. Wooden pens creaked under the weight of restless animals, and the air carried a mix of hay, sweat, and disappointment. Buyers crowded together, some leaning against fences with practiced indifference, others clutching their hats as if a better bargain might gallop out at any moment. Laughter rose and fell like the cries of crows, sharp and cruel, directed more often at the creatures being paraded through than at the men who bid on them. Among the weathered faces, one stood apart. Samuel lingered at the edge of the crowd, his boots worn to softness, his shirt threadbare but clean. His eyes carried a heaviness that was not merely tiredness, but the weight of too many yesterdays that had promised more than they gave. He had not come with money to spend. Truth be told, he had not come with any clear purpose at all. The auction was a place he had visited for years, once as a buyer when his farm thrived, later as a man with little more than habit to guide him. It was easier to be among strangers and horses than to sit alone in the silence of his shack. The auctioneer's voice boomed, raspy with the strain of long hours. Another horse was brought out, a skeletal figure draped in a hide dulled of all shine. Its head hung low, one ear twitching as if listening to a world no longer worth hearing. A limp carried it unevenly across the dirt, and the crowd erupted with mocking whistles. "That one's fit for glue and nothing else," a man barked. "I've seen healthier ghosts," another shouted. Samuel's gaze fixed on the animal. There was something in its posture, not merely the limp or the scars that mapped its flank, but the way its eyes, dark, wide, and still, searched the crowd. They did not flicker with fear nor sink with submission. They looked, steady and unyielding, as though measuring the worth of every man before them. And when those eyes met Samuel's, something within him shifted. The auctioneer tried to raise excitement, though even he sounded half in jest. "Who'll start me off? A fine animal here. Strong bones, well, some bones at least." The laughter rolled again, dismissive, cruel. No hands rose. The horse stood silent, waiting, the dust clinging to its legs like ash. Samuel's heart beat in a rhythm he could not quite name. He told himself it was foolishness to care. He told himself it was none of his concern. Yet the longer the silence stretched, the heavier it pressed upon him. The horse blinked once, slow, deliberate, as though asking him directly, "Will you walk away too?" Before reason could stop him, his hand lifted. "I'll take it," Samuel said, voice rough with disuse. Heads turned. Murmurs rose. The auctioneer smirked, scratching his chin. "Well now, a brave soul. $1, less than a sack of feed. Any other takers?" Silence answered. Not a single hand moved. "Sold then, to the gentleman in the back. 4 pennies. The hammer fell with a hollow crack. Laughter broke loose, louder than before, chasing Samuel as he walked toward the animal. "Hope you've got a shovel, old man," someone jeered. "You just bought yourself a funeral." Another shouted, "That beast'll drag you to ruin quicker than a bottle will." But Samuel did not look back. Up close, the horse seemed even more fragile, its breath shallow but steady, its ribs etched sharp against its skin. Samuel reached out, slow, his hand brushing the rough mane. The animal flinched, but did not retreat. Its eyes held his again, and in them Samuel saw not weakness, but a strange, quiet defiance. He whispered, almost ashamed of the tenderness in his voice, "Guess we're both unwanted, aren't we?" He led it away from the crowd, past wagons and men who still shook their heads at his foolishness. The rope was light in his hand, but the responsibility weighed heavier than anything he had carried in years. As they walked, Samuel felt the eyes on his back fade, replaced by the sound of hooves dragging faintly behind him. Each step was hesitant, yet the horse followed, as though the decision had already been made between them. The road stretched long and empty, the late sun burning low against the horizon. Samuel thought of his past, not in clear pictures, but in fragments. A wife's laughter that had grown distant, children's voices that had drifted away, a farm that had once thrummed with life, but now lay in ruin. He thought of nights filled with silence so deep it pressed against his chest, and mornings that asked nothing of him but endurance. And he thought, perhaps for the first time in years, that he was not entirely alone. At a stream's edge, he paused, letting the horse drink. The animal lowered its head, drinking greedily, water dripping from its muzzle like silver beads. Samuel crouched beside it, splashing his face with the coolness. For a moment, the scene felt almost peaceful, almost as though they belonged to a simpler world where nothing had yet been broken. But Samuel knew better. Life did not offer miracles. He was a man who had lost more than he had gained, and this horse was no gift of fate. It was a creature abandoned because it had failed, just as he had been cast aside by the world. Perhaps that was the very reason he had lifted his hand. The walk home stretched on. Stars began to prick the sky by the time Samuel reached the outline of a small shack, its timbers leaning tiredly, as if mirroring his own frame. He led the horse into the old stable, long and used, its walls thick with dust and the scent of memory. He spread hay clumsily, fetched a bucket of water, and watched as the animal settled with a quiet sigh. Standing there in the dim light, Samuel felt a strange stirring. He had not meant to buy, yet now the horse was his. More than that, it felt as though the creature had chosen him. He leaned on the stall door, watching the animal's flanks rise and fall with each breath, and muttered to himself, "We'll see what tomorrow brings." The horse shifted, lifting its head once more. Its gaze found him in the shadows, steady and unreadable. Samuel felt the weight of that look settle deep inside, a wordless reminder that he had not merely bought a broken horse. He had stepped into something he did not yet understand. The night deepened around them, silence folding in like a blanket. Samuel lingered longer than he meant to, listening to the quiet rhythm of breath and the distant rustle of leaves. For the first time in many years, the silence did not feel entirely empty. It felt like the pause before a story began. The morning broke cool and pale, the kind of dawn that crept gently across the earth instead of bursting into it. Samuel rose stiffly from his cot, the sound of his own bones reminding him of years he could not reclaim. Through the thin walls of the shack, he could hear the faint shuffle of hooves, a restless stirring that drew him to the stable before he had even washed his face. The horse stood waiting, head lifted, eyes glinting in the dim light. It was as though the creature had not closed its eyes through the night. Samuel paused at the stall door, one hand resting on the frame, studying the gaunt shape before him. The ribs still jutted sharp, the mane tangled, but there was a strange presence about it, something he could not place. "You made it through the night," he murmured, his voice carrying both surprise and relief. He moved quietly, scattering a modest pile of hay into the corner. The horse bent to it without hesitation, tearing at the strands with a hunger that made Samuel wince. "Easy now. You'll get more," he whispered, though his stores were pitifully small. He filled the bucket again, watching as the animal drank deep, water spilling across the dirt floor. As the days unfolded, a rhythm began to form. Samuel would rise before the sun, tend to the horse, and speak words aloud that had gone unspoken for years. He told it about the silence of his shack, about the way the world had moved on without him, about the ache of being forgotten. The horse listened in its own way, ears flicking, eyes steady. Sometimes it would shift closer when his voice faltered, and that small nearness felt like comfort. Yet trust was not given easily. The first time Samuel tried to lay a blanket across its back, the horse flinched violently, eyes flashing white, muscles tensing as though some old terror had come alive. Samuel dropped the blanket at once, stepping back, his palms lifted. "All right. No one's hurting you here," he said, his tone soft but firm. The animal snorted, stamping, then after a long moment, lowered its head. It was clear that whatever past it carried had not been kind. It was during one of those quiet evenings, as Samuel brushed the dirt from its coat, that he noticed the scars more clearly. Beneath the dull hair, patterns of old wounds traced along its flank, too deliberate to be accidents. His brow furrowed as he parted the hair further. There, faint but undeniable, was the outline of a brand. Time had blurred its edges, but Samuel knew enough to recognize the mark of a stable, one far beyond the reach of men like him. He stepped back, breath caught in his chest. "What were you?" he asked aloud, though the horse gave no answer. It only watched him with that same steady gaze, unflinching, as though it knew he had begun to see a glimpse of truth. The discovery sat heavy on Samuel's mind. He remembered stories of bloodlines, of champions that had once raced across tracks under the eyes of thousands. He had no proof this horse was one of them, but something in his bones told him it was not ordinary. And yet here it was, sold for pennies, discarded like refuse. just as he himself had once been cast aside, left to wander in the margins of life. Days turned to weeks, and the bond between them deepened. Samuel spoke less to fill the silence, and more because he wanted to share the weight he carried. He told the horse of his wife, who had once braided flowers into his hair when he was a boy. He spoke of children who had long since drifted from his life, letters unanswered, visits never made. He admitted the shame of losing the farm, of watching the land dry beneath his hands no matter how he worked it. And through it all, the horse remained beside him, silent but listening, a witness to confessions no human ear had heard. One evening, as twilight bled across the sky, Samuel led the horse into the open field behind the shack. "Let's see what's left in you," he said, more to himself than the creature. He released the rope, half expecting the animal to stand still. Instead, with a suddenness that startled him, it bolted forward. The limp he had noticed at the auction seemed to vanish as its legs stretched into powerful strides. For a few breathless moments, the horse moved with a grace that belonged not to the broken but to the extraordinary. Samuel watched, his heart hammering. Dust rose in soft clouds as the horse circled, its mane whipping like a banner. It was not speed alone that shook him but precision, the deliberate, trained movements, the instinctive turn of its body as though it remembered lessons drilled long ago. When the horse finally slowed, sweat shining across its flanks, it looked toward Samuel with something fierce in its eyes, as if daring him to deny what he had just seen. Samuel stepped closer, awe mixing with disbelief. "You're not just some cast-off," he said quietly. "You were something once. Maybe still are." That night, as he lay on his cot, sleep eluded him. His mind replayed the sight of the horse running, the scars on its body, the brand half hidden beneath its coat. He felt a stirring inside himself, a dangerous kind of hope. It had been years since he had allowed such a thing. Yet here it was, refusing to be ignored. The days that followed carried both promise and challenge. The horse resisted some of his efforts, shying away from saddles, refusing commands. At times, Samuel doubted himself, wondering if he was trying to carve a future out of shadows. But then he would recall the look in its eyes, the strength that flickered beneath the surface, and he pressed on. The locals had begun to notice. Neighbors passing by would slow their steps, watching the old man lead his scarred horse through the fields. Some smirked, whispering about Samuel's stubbornness, about how he had always been a fool for lost causes. But others, though fewer, looked with quiet curiosity, as though they sensed something was unfolding they could not yet name. One late afternoon, after hours of gentle coaxing, the horse allowed Samuel to rest a hand firmly against its neck. The warmth beneath its skin, the steady beat of its pulse, filled him with an odd reassurance. For the first time, the creature leaned into his touch, if only slightly. It was a small gesture, but to Samuel, it felt monumental. He smiled faintly, whispering, "We're getting there, you and me." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the stable yard. Samuel lingered beside the horse, unwilling to break the fragile thread of trust that had begun to form. As the sky darkened, he knew one thing with certainty. The world had thrown them both away, but together they had begun to uncover a truth the world had missed. And though he could not yet see where it would lead, Samuel felt the faint, unmistakable pull of destiny drawing him forward. The mornings grew earlier with each passing day. Samuel found himself waking before the sun, not because sleep had abandoned him, but because a strange anticipation pulled him from his bed. For the first time in years, his days had purpose. He would step into the stable and find the horse waiting, its ears pricked, eyes sharp in the dim light. There was no longer the lifeless stillness of the auction yard. Instead, there was alertness, a spark of something that demanded attention. Samuel had begun to name it in his head, though he had not spoken the name aloud. Names carried weight, and he was cautious with gifts he might not be able to keep. Still, when he whispered ash under his breath, born from the grayness of its coat and the way it had risen from ruin, it felt right. The horse lifted its head as though recognizing itself in the word. Training began with patience. Samuel started simple, leading Ash in wide circles, teaching trust with the rope. At first, the horse resisted, jerking its head, stamping against the tug of restraint. Samuel did not fight back with force. He stood steady, his voice low, coaxing instead of commanding. "Easy, Ash. We'll get there. Step by step." The struggle was not just of body but of will. Two broken spirits learning how to walk beside one another without fear. Days turned into weeks, and their progress was uneven. There were mornings when Ash responded, following Samuel's lead with surprising precision, and evenings when the horse seemed to crumble back into its own ghosts, skittish and unyielding. Samuel bore the setbacks with a patience he did not know he possessed. He recognized in Ash the same wounds he carried himself, memories that struck without warning, doubts that lingered even in moments of calm. One afternoon, as Samuel tried to settle a worn saddle across Ash's back, the horse exploded into panic. Hooves struck the stall wall, dust flying as Samuel barely stumbled clear. His heart pounded, fear surging through him, but more than fear was frustration. He leaned against the wall, sweat soaking his shirt, staring at the creature that snorted and trembled in the corner. "What am I doing?" he muttered. His voice cracked with the weight of defeat. "You're broken, and maybe I am too." Ash pawed the ground, chest heaving, eyes wide with the memory of some unseen torment. Samuel's anger ebbed as he saw the terror there, not defiance but pain. Slowly, he stepped forward again, hands open, voice steady though his heart shook. "No one's hurting you now. Not while you're mine." He laid the saddle aside and simply rested his hand against Ash's neck until the trembling softened. That night, Samuel sat long into the dark, wondering whether he was chasing a dream that would undo him completely. Yet the next dawn found him trying again. Something deeper than reason kept pulling him back, the same force that had lifted his hand at the auction. Each attempt built upon the last, and though progress was slow, it was progress all the same. Ash began to respond to his voice, to follow without hesitation, to accept the touch of bridle and rope. The limp Samuel had first noticed faded as strength returned, and with it came flashes of brilliance. It was in the field one morning that Samuel witnessed the full measure of Ash's power. He released the rope and gave a soft command, half expecting resistance. Instead, the horse surged forward, running the length of the field with a stride so fluid it stole the breath from Samuel's lungs. Ash turned with sharp precision, hooves cutting the earth in arcs of practiced elegance. It was as if the horse had remembered a language Samuel did not yet know how to speak. Samuel's heart hammered as he watched. This was not an animal stumbling through forgotten steps. This was mastery. It was training etched into bone and sinew, the kind that could not be erased by neglect or cruelty. The realization struck him with both awe and fear. Ash had once belonged to greatness. If anyone else discovered this, they would come to take the horse back, and Samuel would lose the only thing that had given him a reason to rise again. The whispers in town grew louder. Men who had once laughed at the auction began to stop along the road, leaning on fences, watching Samuel lead Ash through drills in the field. Some scoffed openly. "Old fool thinks he's got a champion." Others whispered with curiosity, "You see the way that animal moves? That's no common nag." Samuel ignored them all, but their eyes weighed heavy on his back. One evening, as Samuel brushed Ash's coat beneath the fading light, a figure approached from the road. It was a rancher he vaguely knew, broad-shouldered and smug, with the kind of confidence that came from wealth. He rested an elbow on the fence, smirking. "Word is you've been playing trainer out here. Folks say that horse of yours isn't as worthless as it looked." Samuel did not glance up. "Folks say plenty." The rancher chuckled. "I'll tell you what. There's a fair in 2 weeks. Horses will run, crowds will be watching. Why don't you bring that beast of yours and show us all what you've really got? Or are you afraid folks will see the truth, that you're chasing ghosts?" The challenge hung in the air. Samuel's first instinct was to refuse. He owed nothing to the sneers of men who had mocked him. But when he looked at Ash, standing tall, eyes steady, something stirred in him. He could not deny the chance, not for himself, but for the creature who deserved to be seen for what it truly was. "I'll be there," Samuel said, surprising even himself. The rancher grinned, tipping his hat before walking away. "Then we'll see, old man. We'll see." That night, Samuel sat in the stable beside Ash, listening to the steady rhythm of breath. He felt the weight of what lay ahead pressing upon him. The fair would not simply be a test of Ash's strength, but of his own resolve. Failure would mean humiliation, perhaps worse. But if they succeeded, if they showed the world what he had begun to glimpse, then maybe, just maybe, the story of their lives would change. He rested his hand on Ash's withers, whispering, "It's you and me now. Whatever comes, we face it together." Ash shifted closer, as though answering without words. The night settled deep around them, and Samuel felt both fear and hope coil tightly within him. For the first time, he was not running from the world, but toward it, and he knew the following morning broke with a heavy stillness. Clouds hung low over the valley, their gray bellies promising rain, though none came. Daniel stepped outside, his body aching from another restless night, and found Blaze standing at the fence, ears pricked forward as if he had been waiting. The horse's coat glistened in the dim light, damp with dew, his eyes alive with a fire that Daniel hadn't seen in years. It was almost unnerving, the way Blaze looked at him, not as a possession, not as a tired beast, but as an equal, demanding something. Daniel rubbed his temples, torn between gratitude and fear. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered. "I don't know if I've got it in me anymore." Yet Blaze only tossed his head, pawing the ground, as though refusing to accept defeat. By midday, the auction ground had become a hive of noise. Dust hung thick in the air as horses were let in and out of the small holding pens. Voices rose, some sharp with business, others low with curiosity. Among the crowd, Daniel walked with the stiffness of a man out of place. He hadn't been here in years, but the sight of the weathered boards, the shouting auctioneer, and the pungent mix of sweat and hay pulled him back into old memories he wished had stayed buried. Blaze followed close at his side, his presence earning curious stares. "Isn't that Cooper's old horse?" a man whispered as Daniel passed. "Thought he was finished," another replied, his tone edged with derision. Daniel heard them, though he pretended not to. Every word dug into him like a splinter, reopening wounds of failure he carried beneath his skin. Still, he pressed forward, one hand lightly resting on Blaze's neck, drawing quiet strength from the warmth there. At the center of the arena, the auctioneer's voice boomed, calling out bids for a broad-chested gelding. Men shouted numbers back, their eyes sharp with calculation. Daniel's chest tightened. He wasn't here to buy. He wasn't even sure why he had come at all, until he spotted him. Clive Watterson stood across the ring, dressed in a tailored jacket far too fine for the dusty grounds. His gold watch glinted in the thin sunlight, and his smile was as polished as the boots he never dirted. Around him lingered a circle of younger men, each nodding too quickly, each laughing too loudly at his jokes. Clive had always been that way, loud, arrogant, and eager to remind everyone of his wealth. Daniel froze, memories flooding back. He saw Clive years ago, younger but no less brash, sneering at Blaze when the horse faltered in competition. "Sell him, Cooper," Clive had said then, loud enough for everyone to hear. "That horse is dead weight, just like his rider." Daniel's hands curled into fists now, though he forced himself to breathe. He wasn't here to fight old battles. Yet fate had other plans. Clive's gaze shifted and locked on Daniel. For a moment, silence seemed to fall between them, though the crowd roared around. Recognition flickered in Clive's eyes, followed quickly by amusement. He nudged the man beside him, muttered something, and they both laughed. Then, as if drawn by the scent of weakness, Clive began to cross the arena. "Well, if it isn't Daniel Cooper," Clive said, his voice smooth with mockery. "I thought you disappeared for good." His eyes slid to Blaze, scanning him with an appraiser's coldness. "And look at this. You're still dragging that animal around. Some habits die hard, I suppose." Daniel steadied his breathing, though his jaw tightened. "Blaze isn't yours to judge. Everything here's mine to judge," Clive replied with a smirk. "Especially when men bring broken horses to a place like this. What are you hoping for, Cooper? Pity? Or maybe you've come to sell him for scraps?" Blaze shifted, sensing the tension, and Daniel laid a calming hand on his neck. He wanted to walk away, to keep his silence, but the weight of Clive's sneer pressed against his chest until words forced themselves out. "Blaze isn't broken. Not yet. And neither am I." Clive chuckled, a sharp sound that carried across the arena. "We'll see about that. I've got a stallion coming up next, wild thing, untamable. Maybe I'll buy him, just to show you what a real horse looks like." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "And when he throws me, I'll still land higher than you ever stood." Daniel's stomach churned, but he held Clive's gaze. Something inside him stirred, the faint echo of the man he once was, the man who had believed in second chances. Yet he said nothing, letting Clive's arrogance roll off him like rain on stone. The auctioneer's hammer fell, ending the current sale. Men moved, horses shifted, and the next lot was announced. Daniel turned to leave, but Blaze suddenly pulled against the rope, ears pricked sharply forward. His whole body tensed, eyes locked on the gate where handlers struggled with a rearing, screaming stallion. The animal was all fire and fury, muscles straining, hooves lashing at the air. It took 3 men to drag him inside. The crowd erupted with noise, cheers, jeers, and wagers tossed like coins in the air. Daniel felt Blaze tremble beneath his hand, not with fear, but with recognition. The old gelding stamped the ground, his breath flaring, as though challenging the stallion across the ring. Clive's voice cut through the clamor. "That's mine," he declared, stepping forward with his chin high. "I'll tame him myself. And when I do, everyone here will see the difference between men who still matter and those who don't." Eyes turned to Daniel, expectant, mocking. Some smirked, others whispered, waiting for him to shrink back. But Blaze refused to move, muscles taut, eyes fierce, daring Daniel to stand beside him. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry as ash. He could walk away now, slip into the crowd, and no one would remember him by morning. Or he could stay, face Clive, and risk breaking again in front of everyone. His heart pounded, his palms slick with sweat. The auctioneer shouted above the din, calling for silence. The stallion screamed, rearing high, nearly tearing free from the ropes. Blaze struck the ground in answer, his nostrils flaring, his old body alive with forgotten fire. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the stir of something he thought he had lost, the weight of choice, of destiny pressing against his chest. His eyes met Clive's, and for a heartbeat the arena seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the 2 men and the horses that defined them. Daniel drew in a long, steady breath. "Then let's see," he said, his voice low but carrying. The crowd fell into an eager hush. The air between them crackled, heavy with expectation, as though the storm clouds above had finally lowered to earth. The courtroom grew heavier with each breath, the quiet shuffle of papers echoing like thunder against the wood-paneled walls. Samuel stood with his back straight, though the years had bent him, and his eyes, once sharp as a hawk's, now carried a weariness that could not be hidden. His horse, Bramble, stood tethered outside the window in the courtyard, its presence felt even through the glass. Every man and woman in the room knew that what was about to unfold was not merely a matter of property, but of loyalty and love carved out through a lifetime of hardship. The opposing counsel, a younger man with polished shoes and a voice that dripped with practiced confidence, pressed his case with cold precision. He spoke of contracts, debts, and obligations, reducing Bramble to nothing more than an asset, a figure scribbled in ink. To him, the horse was worth only what could be written on paper. But to Samuel, that creature outside was more than flesh and bone. He was memory, companion, and the last reminder of a life well fought and barely held together. Samuel's lawyer, a quiet woman with steady eyes, rose to her feet. She didn't waste words. Instead, she told the court of the night Samuel had slept in barns to keep Bramble warm, of the battles the man had survived only because his horse had carried him through when his own legs could not. She painted no grand illusions, no flowery arguments, just the simple truth that this was not about ownership, but about the bond between man and beast. The judge listened, though his expression betrayed little. His gavel rested silent in his hand, as if even he feared breaking the fragile air in the room. Samuel glanced at him only once, then let his gaze drift back to the window. He thought of the day he had first laid eyes on Bramble, a half-starved creature trembling at auction, dismissed by others as worthless. Samuel had seen something then, a spark, faint but defiant, and he had carried that spark into years of companionship. Now, it felt as though all of that history stood trial beside him. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was soft, but it carried across the courtroom with the weight of lived truth. "I'm not here to argue numbers," he said, his hand tightening on his cane. "All I ask is the chance to say goodbye to the one soul that never turned his back on me." His words silenced even the younger lawyer, who shifted uneasily in his chair. The judge leaned forward, studying Samuel for a long moment, as though weighing not just the case, but the man himself. The pause stretched, each second thrumming with anticipation. Outside, Bramble gave a restless snort, the sound filtering faintly through the glass, almost as if he too was waiting for the verdict. Then, with a measured breath, the judge set his gavel down without striking it. His eyes softened, and though no final ruling came, his next words made it clear the story was far from over. "Mr. Samuel," he said quietly, "bring your horse inside." The room erupted in murmurs, the conflict unresolved, yet shifting into a deeper test of faith and courage. And Samuel, with a trembling hand, reached for the door, knowing that the moment to come would change everything.